My name is Ashley Graham. I am 28 years old. 2 weeks ago, I sat at my father's mahogany dining table in Charlotte, North Carolina, while my older sister Jessica read from a yellow legal pad. The script was a carefully rehearsed guilt trip demanding I sign over my $225,000 inheritance to her. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table. He looked me straight in the eye and said that if I did not sign the transfer papers today, I was no longer his daughter. He called me greedy. He said family wealth belongs to the family, and Jessica needed it to save her business from bankruptcy. They thought they had me trapped. They expected me to cry and hand over my future. They did not realize the quiet man sitting next to me was Julian Sterling, a senior fraud auditor for the Trust Management Bank. Julian let Jessica finish every single line of her tearful demand. He watched the performance without blinking. Then he set his pen down on the wood, looked directly at my father, and asked who had written the forged wire authorization form submitted to his office that Tuesday. My father stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and cracked against the hardwood floor. Before anyone could reach the door, Julian informed them the account was permanently locked pending a federal review. Before I explain the fallout of that room, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Elderly Stories, but only if you know what it feels like to be targeted by your own flesh and blood. Drop your age, your location, and the local time in the comments below. I always like knowing who is listening. Now let me take you back 4 weeks to the day the money cleared and my family decided I owed them my life savings. I work as a pediatric physical therapist. My days are spent lifting kids out of wheelchairs and helping them learn to walk. It is demanding work. I put in 50 hours a week to afford a small townhouse on the edge of the city. I drive a 6-year-old sedan and I track every dollar I spend. My sister Jessica lives a different reality. She runs a boutique fitness studio that never seems to have any actual clients, yet she drives a luxury SUV and takes regular trips to the coast. Our father funded her lifestyle for a decade, covering her rent and bailing her out of bad investments. My maternal grandmother watched this dynamic play out for years. She knew my father had a history of terrible financial decisions and enabled Jessica at every turn. When my grandmother passed away, she bypassed them both. She left her savings in a restricted trust designed to transfer to me on my 28th birthday. The total was $225,000. It was money meant for a down payment for security for a life where I did not have to panic over an unexpected medical bill. For 2 years before my birthday, my father barely spoke to me. He never visited my townhouse. Jessica only texted on major holidays. But the week the trust officer confirmed the funds were ready for transfer, the silence ended. My father showed up at my front door on a Tuesday evening, holding a brown paper bag of expensive groceries. He walked into my kitchen, unpacked organic produce I could never afford, and started asking pointed questions about my financial goals. He wanted to know which bank I used. He asked if I needed help managing a large sum. I watched him line up apples on my counter and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The neglect was over. The hunt had started. To understand why my father stood in my kitchen lining up expensive fruit while asking for the bank routing number, you need to understand the quiet rhythm of the life I built without him. Every morning my alarm goes off at 5 o'clock. By 6, I am driving my 10-year-old sedan down the interstate, heading to a pediatric rehabilitation clinic in downtown Charlotte. The air in the clinic always smells like medical-grade surface cleaner and bubble gum. My job is to take children whose bodies refuse to cooperate and teach them how to move. I spend my days on my knees on padded gym mats, guiding small feet into custom leg braces, celebrating every hard-earned step. It leaves my lower back aching and my hands raw, but I earn every single paycheck. Those paychecks cover the rent on my cramped townhouse in an older neighborhood where the floorboards squeak. They cover my car insurance and the student loans I took out to get my degree. I track my grocery budget on a digital spreadsheet. I buy my work scrubs on clearance. I built a stable, boring, secure existence, and I did it alone because I had no other choice. My sister Jessica chose a different path, or rather my father paved one for her. Jessica is 3 years older than me and operates a boutique cycling studio in a high-rent commercial district. If you walk past her studio, you will see imported marble reception desks and neon inspirational signs on the walls. What you will rarely see are paying customers. Yet Jessica arrives every morning in a leased luxury vehicle, carrying an $8 iced matcha latte, wearing designer athletic sets that cost more than my weekly food budget. Our father covers her commercial lease. He pays her car note. Whenever her business account dips into the red, he transfers funds from his own dwindling retirement savings to keep the illusion alive. Growing up, I learned quickly that being the responsible child meant being the invisible child. My father poured all his attention and resources into Jessica because she demanded them loudly. I learned early on that needing things caused stress, so I stopped asking for help. My maternal grandmother Vivian saw right through this toxic dynamic. She was a sharp, practical woman who kept her own ledgers and trusted very few people with numbers. She watched my father lose my childhood home in a series of disastrous day trading schemes when I was a teenager. She watched him drain a college savings account to fund one of Jessica's failed retail startup ideas a decade ago. Before she passed away, my grandmother restructured her estate with ruthless precision. She knew that if she left her money to my father, he would squander it to cover his own mounting debts. She knew that if she left it to Jessica, it would disappear into luxury coastal vacations and unpaid credit cards, so she bypassed them entirely. She placed $225,000 into a locked legal trust. The stipulations were ironclad. The money would sit untouched, accumulating interest until the day I turned 28 years old. My father was legally barred from acting as the trustee. Jessica was not mentioned in the document at all. It was ghost money floating just out of reach, waiting for me to grow up. For years, the trust felt like an abstract concept. I focused on my patients, my rent, and maintaining my quiet life. My father and sister seemed to forget about it too. Or at least they pretended to. My father had not visited my townhouse since the day I moved in 2 years ago. Jessica usually remembered my existence around the holidays, sending generic text messages with a string of heart emojis. But the dynamic shifted the exact moment the calendar turned to my 28th birthday. The bank sent an automated email at dawn, confirming the funds had been released into my name. It was the most money I had ever seen in my life. It was a down payment on a real house with a yard. It was profound safety. 4 hours after that email arrived, my phone rang. It was my father. He rarely called me before noon, usually relying on social media reminders to remember my birthday. But that morning, his voice was bright, energetic, and heavy with a sudden suffocating interest in my future. He asked how I felt being a wealthy woman. He laughed, but the sound was hollow and practiced. That evening, he showed up at my front door unannounced. He brought a paper bag of expensive organic groceries, walked straight into my kitchen, and started reorganizing my counter space. He examined my appliances. He asked what interest rate my bank was offering. He asked if I had considered moving the funds to a private brokerage account. The benign neglect of my childhood evaporated overnight. It was replaced by a claustrophobic, intense focus. My father started texting me links to financial articles about inflation eating away at savings. He called me during my lunch breaks at the clinic to tell me about commercial real estate investment properties he had his eye on. He started using the word we. He said we need to be smart about this capital. He said we should sit down and look at the tax implications. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time my screen lit up with his name. I was no longer his independent daughter. I was a sudden untapped resource, and he was circling me. Then Jessica joined the hunt. A week after my birthday, she invited me to brunch at a high-end restaurant she knew I could not afford. She arrived wearing fresh salon highlights and a tight smile. She ordered bottomless mimosas and spent the first hour complaining about how difficult it was to be a small business owner. She talked about the rising cost of utilities, the unreliability of her fitness instructors, and the severe stress of keeping her studio afloat. I sat quietly drinking black coffee, waiting for the real reason she invited me. It arrived with the check. Jessica let the leather bill folder sit between us for a long moment before looking up at me. She smiled, sliding the check toward my side of the table. She said Dad mentioned the trust finally cleared. She told me I must be thrilled to have so much disposable income now. The implication was crystal clear. I was expected to pay. I was expected to start funding her life the same way our father did. I placed a $20 bill on the table to cover my black coffee, told her I was strictly budgeting for a house, and walked out of the restaurant. The drive back to my townhouse felt different that afternoon. The air in my car felt heavy. By setting a firm boundary over a simple brunch bill, I had signaled to both of them that I was not going to hand over the keys to my grandmother's savings. I thought the worst they would do was act cold or stop calling me for a few months. I underestimated the sheer desperation of people who believe they are entitled to what you have earned. I thought I was dealing with a jealous sister and an overbearing father. I did not realize they were preparing a coordinated strike against my identity. My refusal to pay for her brunch forced their hand, and the subtle probing quickly mutated into an engineered crisis. That night, I finally fell asleep around 10 o'clock, exhausted from a grueling shift at the rehabilitation center. An hour later, my phone lit up the dark bedroom, vibrating endlessly on my nightstand. It was Jessica, and she was crying so hard she could barely breathe. The vibration of my phone against the wooden nightstand sounded like a drill in the silent bedroom. I squinted at the bright digital clock glowing on the screen. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. The caller ID displayed my sister's name. I had just finished a 10-hour shift at the rehabilitation clinic, spending my afternoon supporting the body weight of a teenager learning to use a prosthetic leg. My muscles were screaming for rest. But the programming installed by my father ran deep. I answered on the third ring, my voice thick with sleep. Jessica did not say hello. She bypassed any greeting and launched straight into breathless, heavy sobs. The sound was engineered to cause maximum distress. It immediately triggered a physical reaction in my chest, a tightening born from 28 years of conditioning. Whenever my sister cried, it meant someone else was about to pay the price. When we were teenagers, Jessica once backed our father's truck into a neighbor's brick mailbox, shattering the taillight and denting the bumper. She ran into the house sobbing exactly like this. My father did not punish her. Instead, he handed me a bucket of soapy water and told me to scrub the brick dust off the bumper while he paid the neighbor off. I was always expected to absorb the shockwaves of her mistakes. I sat up in bed, switched on the lamp, and told her to breathe. She claimed her boutique cycling studio was facing a catastrophic legal disaster. Her words tumbled out in a panicked rush. She said a client had fallen off a defective stationary bike during a high-intensity class 2 months ago. According to her story, the woman suffered severe spinal injuries requiring emergency surgery and months of rehabilitation. Jessica claimed her commercial liability insurance provider was refusing to cover the damages because her equipment maintenance logs were out of date. She wailed that if she did not settle out of court by the end of the week, the plaintiff's attorney was going to place a lien on her business. She said she was going to lose the studio, her luxury SUV, and her house. She was going to end up on the street. The solution to this impending doom was conveniently liquid cash. She said the opposing counsel agreed to drop the entire case for a private settlement of $75,000. My initial reaction was pure empathy. I felt a sharp pang of horror for her, and even more sympathy for the imaginary injured woman. As a physical therapist, I deal with the brutal reality of spinal trauma every single day. I know the devastating physical and financial cost of that kind of injury. But because I work in the healthcare industry, I also know exactly how personal injury claims function. As the fog of sleep cleared from my brain, the timeline she presented started to grate against logic. A serious injury claim involving emergency surgery does not jump straight to asset seizure in 8 weeks. Insurance companies do not drop major commercial policies over a single late maintenance log without a drawn-out formal investigation by an adjuster. I pushed the heavy quilt off my legs, walked out to my small kitchen, and pulled a yellow notepad from a drawer. The cold linoleum floor under my bare feet helped ground me. I clicked a pen and started asking basic procedural questions. I kept my tone soft, trying not to spook her. I asked for the name of the injured client so I could look up her recovery prognosis. Jessica paused. Her crying hitched awkwardly before she claimed her lawyer advised her not to disclose any names. I asked for the name of the law firm representing the plaintiff. She deflected again, saying it was a massive corporate firm downtown and she was too stressed to remember the exact partners on the letterhead. I pressed further, asking what day she was formally served with the court summons by a process server. Instead of answering my questions, Jessica escalated her performance. The pitch of her voice climbed to a frantic shriek. She accused me of interrogating her while her entire life was crumbling. She said she called her sister for comfort and support, not a hostile deposition. She leaned heavily into the emotional manipulation tactics our father had perfected. She reminded me that we shared the same blood, that family must stand together during dark times, and that our late grandmother would be profoundly ashamed of me for hoarding wealth while she faced financial ruin. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. A part of my brain, the part trained to be the easy child, just wanted to transfer the funds to make the crying stop. It is exhausting to be the only person holding a firm boundary. But the ghost money sitting in my new trust account was not just a number on a digital screen. It was my freedom. It was the hard-earned reward for years of scrubbing hospital mats and eating discount meals to survive. I could not hand over a third of my inheritance based on a story full of gaping procedural holes. I took a deep breath and kept my voice perfectly level. I told Jessica I loved her and I wanted to help her navigate this legal nightmare. I explained that paying an unverified off-the-record settlement directly to a plaintiff without proper legal representation was incredibly dangerous and left her vulnerable to future extortion. I offered a practical protective solution. I told her I would not wire $75,000 in cash to her personal checking account. Instead, I offered to retain a top-tier corporate defense attorney on her behalf. I promised to pay the law firm directly from my trust to handle the negotiations and protect her assets legally. The transformation on the other end of the line was instantaneous. The weeping stopped entirely. The breathless, frantic panic vanished. The silence that followed was sharp, cold, and heavy. When Jessica finally spoke, her voice dropped an octave. It was flat, hard, and laced with pure, undisguised hostility. She told me to forget it. She said she did not need a lawyer, she just needed the money. She accused me of wanting to control her life just because I finally had a little bit of leverage over her. Before I could even respond to the sudden venom in her tone, she ended the call. The abrupt dial tone echoed in my quiet kitchen. I stood alone under the harsh fluorescent overhead light, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The immediate shift from desperate victim to furious aggressor confirmed every underlying suspicion I had. I left the notepad on the counter, walked back to my bedroom, and opened my laptop. I navigated directly to the official website for the North Carolina State Court System. In Mecklenburg County, civil lawsuits and public records are easily searchable through a centralized online database. You just need to select the civil docket and type in a name. My hands were shaking slightly as I typed in her full legal name. I clicked the search button. The page loaded a blank result. I cleared the field and typed in the registered LLC name of her boutique cycling studio. I hit search again. The screen returned the exact same blank page. 0 pending cases, 0 civil judgments, 0 liability liens. There was no injured client. There was no impending trial. The entire catastrophic emergency was a calculated, fabricated lie designed to separate me from my inheritance. I slowly closed the laptop, realizing the real conflict had only just begun. The blank search result on the court database lingered on my glowing laptop screen like a physical threat. I did not sleep the rest of the night. By sunrise, I was brewing a pot of cheap coffee, my mind turning over the sheer scale of my sister's deception. I expected Jessica to call back and scream. I expected a barrage of angry text messages. Instead, my phone buzzed at 8 o'clock with a single text from my father. "Meet me at the diner on 4th Street at noon. We need to talk about your sister." There was no greeting. There was no polite request. Just a cold directive. The enforcer had been called in. The diner smelled of stale fry oil and bitter black coffee. It was a relic from my childhood. A cramped establishment with cracked vinyl booths and flickering neon signs in the grease-stained windows. I found my father sitting in a back corner booth. He wore a crisp blue button-down shirt, his posture rigid, his hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug. He did not smile when I slid into the seat across from him. He did not ask how my morning shift at the clinic went. He stared at me with a flat, calculating expression that told me I was no longer his daughter. I was a structural obstacle that needed to be removed. "Your sister is in serious trouble," he began, keeping his voice dangerously low so the waitress wiping the next table would not hear. "And you are playing games with her future." I looked at his hands. They were steady. He fully believed the narrative he was spinning. I told him I looked up the county court records and knew there was no personal injury lawsuit. I expected him to flinch or act surprised that I had caught the lie. He merely waved his hand, brushing away the fabrication as if it were an irrelevant detail. "She is drowning in debt, Ashley. The specific details do not matter. What matters is that she needs capital to save her business, and you are sitting on a pile of family wealth doing nothing to help." He used the phrase family wealth 3 times in the span of 2 minutes. He deliberately erased my grandmother from the equation. Vivian had worked for 40 years as a public school administrator, carefully saving every dime she earned. She drafted a legally binding document to ensure her life savings bypassed his reckless hands. But sitting in that greasy booth, my father systematically rewrote our history. He painted my grandmother as a confused, bitter woman and framed the trust fund as a communal pot of money that I was maliciously hoarding. He leaned across the scratched formica table, his eyes locking onto mine. "You have always been so selfish," he whispered, his tone laced with disappointment. "You have a secure job. You do not have the overhead Jessica has. You do not understand the extreme pressure she is under to maintain her brand. You are holding her hostage over a technicality." The accusation of selfishness struck a deep, familiar nerve. It was the exact same script he used when I was 17 years old. I had spent an entire summer working double shifts at a local grocery store bagging produce to buy a used laptop for college. I saved $800 keeping the cash in a shoebox under my bed. 2 weeks before classes started, Jessica wrecked the transmission on her sedan. My father marched into my bedroom, took the shoebox, and told me I was being greedy for wanting a new computer when my sister could not even drive to her part-time job. He promised to pay me back. He never did. I started my freshman year writing term papers on library computers while Jessica drove a repaired car she eventually abandoned in a tow lot. My personal victories were always treated as raw material to pave over her failures. I sat in the diner booth feeling that same 17-year-old helplessness threatening to choke me. But I was not a teenager anymore. I had a medical degree. I healed broken bodies for a living. I owned my own life. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me, and I realized he only saw me as a bank vault standing in the way of his favorite child. I told him the money was staying in the trust. I told him Jessica needed to sell her luxury SUV if she was truly drowning in debt. His face darkened. The thin veneer of the concerned parent vanished, replaced by a chilling, quiet rage. "If you walk out of here without agreeing to transfer those funds," he stated, measuring every single syllable, "you are done. Do not call me on holidays. Do not show up at my house. You can take your little bank account and live a very lonely life." He was weaponizing my deepest fear. The fear of being an orphan while my parents were still alive. He expected me to crumble, to apologize, to reach for a pen to make the profound discomfort stop. I looked at his coffee mug, then up at his face. I slid a $5 bill across the table to cover my untouched ice water and stood up. I told him I accepted his terms. I turned my back on him and walked out the heavy glass doors. The bright sunlight hit my face and the humid North Carolina air filled my lungs. My legs felt like lead, but I kept walking toward my car. I spent the rest of the day in a numb, protective haze. The emotional toll of being excommunicated by my own father drained every ounce of my physical energy. I went home, locked the deadbolt, and curled into the corner of my couch. I convinced myself the worst part was over. I believed that by setting the boundary and accepting the punishment, the battle was finished. I thought they would simply shut me out and move on to their next scheme. I was foolish to think they would surrender that easily. The sun went down, casting long shadows across my living room floor. At exactly 8:15, my cell phone chimed from the coffee table. It was a standard notification sound, crisp and sharp in the quiet house. I picked up the device expecting a message from a coworker asking to cover a shift at the clinic. Instead, I saw a push notification from my banking application. The email icon displayed a single unread message. I tapped the screen and opened my secure inbox. The sender was the automated portal for the Trust Management Division. The subject line read, "Action required on your account." I clicked the message, my eyes scanning the brief automated text. It said, "Your request to add an authorized signer to your trust account has been received and is currently under review." The blood drained from my face. My breathing stopped entirely. I stared at the bright white screen until the black text blurred. I had not logged into the banking portal in 3 days. I had never requested a cosigner. The boundary I set at the diner meant nothing to them. They were not waiting for my permission anymore. The email sat in my inbox like a live grenade. The timestamp showed the request had been submitted less than an hour after I walked out of the diner. My father had not issued an empty threat. He had executed a backup plan. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. This was no longer a toxic family argument over holiday dinner. This was a documented financial crime. I reached into my purse, pulled out the thick envelope containing my original trust documents, and found the emergency contact number for the Wealth Management Division. I dialed the digits, my thumb hovering over the screen. The automated voice system was a labyrinth designed to test human endurance. I pressed 0. I spoke the word representative into the receiver. I navigated through 5 different menus, listening to a cheerful robotic voice thank me for my patience while a smooth jazz track looped in the background. My hands were trembling so much I had to place the phone flat on the coffee table and put it on speaker. Every second ticking by felt like another dollar draining from my future. After 11 minutes of hold music, the line clicked. A calm, deep voice broke the silence. The man introduced himself as Julian Sterling, a senior investigator in the Fraud and Security Department. I explained who I was and gave him my trust account number. I told him I just received an alert about a cosigner request and that I had never authorized anyone to access my funds. Julian did not offer empty apologies or patronizing reassurance. He switched immediately into a clinical, hyper-focused mode. He asked me a series of security questions to verify my identity. He needed my social security number, my mother's maiden name, and the exact date the trust was established. I provided every answer without hesitating. "I hear you typing," I said, staring at the phone on my table. "Tell me what they did." Julian paused his keyboard strokes. He informed me that a formal authorization form had been submitted to their processing center earlier that afternoon. The document requested that Jessica be granted full signing privileges on the account, which would allow her to withdraw funds, write checks, and initiate wire transfers without my secondary approval. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I asked how the request was delivered. Julian told me it was sent via fax to their secure document intake line. "I need to see it," I told him. "I need you to show me exactly what they submitted." Julian explained that sharing internal intake documents required a secure portal verification, but given the active fraud alert, he could email me an encrypted link. 2 minutes later, a new message hit my inbox. I clicked the link, entered a temporary password Julian provided over the phone, and a high-resolution PDF loaded onto my laptop screen. The document was a standard bank authorization form. The fields were filled out in a neat, generic typed font. It listed my sister's full legal name, her home address, and her date of birth. But my eyes bypassed the typed letters and zeroed in on the bottom of the page. Right there on the primary account holder line was my signature. I leaned closer to the glowing screen. The air in my living room felt remarkably thin. The signature was not a clumsy imitation. It was not a shaky attempt to mimic my handwriting by someone trying to guess my loops and slants. It was my exact signature. But something was wrong with it. As a physical therapist, my days involve filling out endless medical charts and insurance forms. My handwriting has evolved into a rushed, tight script. The signature on the PDF was wide, careful, and deliberate. The tail of the letter Y hooked upward at a sharp angle. I knew that specific hook. I stared at the digital ink and felt the floor drop out from under me. I was looking at a ghost from a decade ago. When I was 19 years old, I had to take out a supplemental student loan to cover my sophomore year tuition. My father insisted on handling the paperwork. He printed out a master promissory note on thick paper. I signed it at his kitchen counter using a cheap blue ballpoint pen that skipped on the final letter, leaving a tiny gap in the ink on the tail of the Y. My father always kept a meticulous filing cabinet in his home office. He kept copies of every legal document, every birth certificate, every loan agreement. The signature on the bank form had that exact same microscopic gap in the ink. It was a photocopied trace. My father had dug through his office files, found a 10-year-old financial document, lifted my signature, and digitally pasted it onto a fraudulent bank authorization form to give my sister access to my inheritance. He was not just an enabler covering for his favorite child. He was the architect of the theft. Julian's voice cut through the heavy silence in my living room. He asked if I recognized the signature. I told him it was mine, but it was copied from a student loan application signed nearly 10 years ago. I explained the gap in the ink and the outdated slant of the letters. Julian typed another rapid sequence of notes. He told me the situation was highly severe. He advised me to verbally authorize a total lockdown on the trust. A hard freeze meant no money could move in or out, not even by me, until a full internal investigation was concluded. He warned me that resolving this could take weeks and would require sworn affidavits. I looked at the forged signature on my screen. I thought about my father sitting in the diner drinking his coffee, looking me in the eye and threatening to disown me while knowing he had already filed the paperwork to steal my future. The deep ingrained guilt of the easy child evaporated. The fear of being a bad daughter vanished. In its place, a cold, sharp clarity settled over my mind. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Lock the account, I told Julian. Freeze every single penny. Julian confirmed the freeze was active. He advised me to file a police report in the morning to document the identity theft. He said the bank would reject the cosigner application and flag my sister's name in their internal security system. He treated it like the end of the procedure. He assumed I just wanted to block the transaction and walk away unharmed. But blocking the transaction was no longer enough. Walking away would just teach my father and sister that they could attempt to ruin my life and face zero consequences when they failed. They needed to understand that I was not a resource they could harvest whenever they felt desperate. I kept the phone on speaker and leaned closer to the microphone. Julian, I asked, my voice steady and quiet, what happens if we can prove exactly who sent this fax? Julian stopped typing. He took a slow breath. He told me that submitting a forged financial document across state lines to a federally insured institution is not a simple family dispute. It classifies as wire fraud. He explained that if the bank's fraud division obtains concrete proof of the origin, they are required by federal regulations to escalate the matter to external authorities. The bank does not just decline the form. They build a prosecutorial file. I stared at the PDF, tracing the path of my stolen name with my index finger. I told Julian not to reject the form just yet. I asked him to leave the application in a pending status. I needed my father and sister to believe their plan was working. I needed them to feel confident. Julian warned me that playing games with active fraud investigations was dangerous. He said he could not keep a fraudulent document pending indefinitely without risking compliance violations. I promised him I only needed a few days. I told him I was going to secure the definitive proof he needed to trace the forgery directly to the source. Julian agreed to flag the file as a pending fraud review, keeping it active, but harmless in the system. I hung up the phone and closed my laptop. The house was quiet again. I had just transformed from a victim trying to protect her savings into a strategist laying a trap. I thought I had everything under control. I thought I had time to gather my evidence carefully. I did not realize that Jessica, assuming the bank fax would clear without any issues, had already moved forward with her own reckless plan. While I was talking to Julian, my sister was using the promise of my locked money to dig a hole so deep neither of us might ever climb out. My phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail from a local number I did not recognize, carrying a message that would drag me directly into the center of her financial collapse. The next morning brought a heavy, suffocating humidity typical of late summer in North Carolina. I woke up to a quiet phone, which in my family meant the tactical phase had begun. My father and sister operated under the assumption that their forged fax was quietly working its way through the banking bureaucracy. They believed they held the winning hand. Because they thought victory was imminent, they decided to punish me for making the initial request difficult. By noon, my social media feeds transformed into a highly curated weapon. Jessica began posting vague, stylized quote graphics on her profile. The text featured elegant cursive fonts over pictures of stormy oceans and solitary wolves. The messages were textbook emotional manipulation. They talked about how true family shows up during the hardest storms and how greed ruins the purest bloodlines. She posted a long, tearful video on her stories, carefully angled to catch the best lighting in her expensive kitchen. In the video, she did not mention my name, but she spoke about facing a devastating betrayal from the person she trusted most. She dabbed at dry eyes and thanked her loyal followers for supporting a struggling small business owner through an unexpected dark season. In the South community, reputation functions as a tangible currency. Keeping up appearances is an enforced social contract. My family spent decades building a facade of upper-middle-class respectability, and Jessica was the shining star of that illusion. The fallout from her digital performance was instantaneous. By 2 o'clock, my phone started buzzing with texts from mutual friends and extended relatives. Aunt Susan sent a lengthy message asking why I was abandoning my sister in her hour of need. My cousin David left a voicemail implying I had let my new inheritance turn me into a cold, arrogant person. They did not ask for my side of the story because Jessica had already provided a compelling tragic narrative. I sat in the break room at the physical therapy clinic, staring at the screen as the messages piled up. I felt a familiar creeping isolation. Setting a firm boundary in my family meant accepting the role of the villain. For years, I avoided conflict specifically to prevent this exact type of public shaming. The pressure was designed to make me cave, to make me apologize, and hand over the money just to restore my social standing. But the shame did not work this time. The forged signature sitting in my email inbox acted as a shield. I knew the truth, and I knew they were celebrating a victory they had not actually won. I finished my shift, documented my patient charts, and walked out to my car. The oppressive heat of the parking lot matched the tension settling in my shoulders. Before turning the ignition, I checked the voicemail that had arrived the previous night during my phone call with Julian Sterling. I pressed play, expecting an angry tirade from my father. Instead, a gruff, unfamiliar voice filled the cabin of my sedan. The man identified himself as Marcus, a private lending agent operating out of a commercial suite across town. He was not calling from a standard commercial bank. His tone was clipped, professional, and completely devoid of patience. He stated he was calling regarding the short-term bridge loan application filed under Jessica's business entity. Then he delivered a sentence that made my lungs stop expanding. He said his office had received the initial pledge paperwork, but they needed the primary trust account holder to physically sign the final collateral guarantee forms. By Friday, or the $75,000 advance would be recalled immediately. I listened to the recording 3 times. The words arranged themselves into a terrifying new picture. Jessica did not just invent a fake personal injury lawsuit to guilt me into giving her cash. The reality was much more reckless. My sister was drowning in severe, very real personal debt, likely a mountain of maxed-out credit cards and unpaid studio leases. Traditional banks would never extend a line of credit to someone with her financial history. So she sought out a hard money lender. These private agents provide fast capital, but they require ironclad collateral. Jessica had promised them my inheritance. Assuming my father's forged fax would successfully add her name to my trust account, she used the pending $225,000 balance as leverage to secure a $75,000 cash advance. She tethered my legal name to a shadow debt, without my knowledge, banking on the fact that she could finalize the cosigner process before the lender verified the asset. Hard money loans are notorious for their predatory structure. They bypass standard credit checks and focus entirely on liquid assets or real estate. The interest rates are punishing, and the collection methods are relentless. Jessica had taken out this loan knowing she could not pay it back through her failing business. She designed the entire structure around the assumption that my trust fund would act as a safety net. She essentially stole my financial credibility to float her lavish lifestyle for a few more months. My father had enabled her bad habits for decades, but providing her with a forged document to secure a shadow loan elevated his behavior from bad parenting to active criminal conspiracy. They were willing to sacrifice my credit, my safety, and my future just to keep her studio doors open a little longer. This was the fifth layer of the betrayal, and it shifted the ground beneath my feet. If I simply walked away, ignored her social media posts, and let Julian quietly block the fax, Jessica's private loan would collapse. But the lender already had my name on their pledge paperwork. They had my phone number. Private creditors do not just vanish when a deal falls through, they pursue the assets promised to them. Jessica had effectively painted a target on my back, dragging me into a legally binding mess with a third party. The protective bubble I tried to build around my quiet life was pierced. I realized with crystalline clarity that surviving this required more than a defensive stance. Cutting them off and changing my phone number would not sever the financial chains they were trying to wrap around my neck. I could not just stop the theft. I had to destroy the mechanism they used to attempt it, and I had to do it in a way that left zero room for interpretation. If I went to the police right then, it would become a messy back-and-forth argument, easily spun by my father as a misunderstanding over estate planning. To win, I needed them to corner themselves. I needed them to admit what they did while the trap was already closed. I put my car in gear and drove out of the clinic parking lot. My mind shifted from fear to cold calculation. I needed to assemble an undeniable package of evidence. I needed the digital footprints, the voice recordings, and the ultimate witness. I pulled into my driveway, picked up my phone, and drafted a brief text message to my father. I typed that I was ready to stop fighting and wanted to meet on Sunday to sign the necessary paperwork for Jessica. The response arrived 3 seconds later, sealing their fate. The 3 animated dots appeared on my screen before I could even set the phone down. My father replied to my text message in less than 10 seconds. His response was brief, enthusiastic, and entirely devoid of the cold venom he used at the diner. He told me he was proud of me for finally seeing reason. He instructed me to come to his house in the suburbs this Sunday at 2 in the afternoon for a final family meeting. He reminded me to bring my driver license and my checkbook to sign the necessary paperwork to help my sister. I read his message and felt nothing. The crushing weight of the betrayal was gone, replaced by a sharp clinical focus. In my profession, panic is useless. When a patient arrives at the rehabilitation clinic dealing with severe physical trauma, I cannot let my own emotions dictate the session. I have to look at the torn ligaments and the damaged nerves as mechanical problems that require systematic solutions. I applied that exact same clinical detachment to my family. They were no longer my father and my sister. They were a mechanical problem. They had built a machine designed to extract my grandmother's money, and my job was to dismantle that machine piece by piece. I entered a phase of my life where I operated purely on documentation. I became a detective hunting my own blood relatives. On Wednesday morning, I called the Trust Management Division and requested Julian Sterling by his direct extension. When he answered, his voice carried the same steady, unflappable tone as before. I did not waste time with small talk. I told him about the voicemail from Marcus, the private lender. I explained how Jessica used the pending cosigner application to secure a shadow debt in my name. I played the recorded voicemail over the speaker so Julian could hear the exact terms the lender was demanding. Julian was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his professional demeanor had sharpened into active intrigue. Financial criminals usually try to cover their tracks, but the sheer brazenness of my family fascinated him. They were committing wire fraud in broad daylight and linking it to third-party creditors without a second thought. I asked Julian if he had examined the metadata on the forged authorization form they faxed to his department. He confirmed he had pulled the digital footprints that morning. Every fax machine or digital scanning service leaves a unique identifying stamp, an IP address, that traces the document back to its origin. Julian ran the numbers through the bank security database. The origin point was a residential internet provider. The zip code matched my father's affluent suburban neighborhood perfectly. I asked Julian to email me a certified copy of that metadata report. I wanted the IP address, the timestamp, and the origin location documented in writing. He agreed. I saved the PDF into a newly created folder on my desktop named Receipts. Next, I exported the audio file of the voicemail from the hard money lender. I emailed the audio clip to 3 different secure accounts. If my phone broke, or if my father somehow managed to confiscate it during our Sunday meeting, the evidence would survive in the cloud. I had the origin of the forgery and the proof of the shadow debt. The final piece of the puzzle was dismantling the fabricated emergency my sister used to justify the theft. I spent Wednesday evening conducting a forensic audit of Jessica's social media presence. She had spent the last 48 hours posting tearful videos about her impending financial ruin, rallying our extended relatives against me. But the internet is a permanent ledger, and Jessica lacked the discipline to maintain her own lie. I scrolled back through her posts over the last 8 weeks, the exact time frame she claimed to be battling a catastrophic personal injury lawsuit. The contradictions were glaring, arrogant, and fully documented. On the specific Tuesday, she claimed she was first threatened with bankruptcy. She posted a photograph of herself holding a new designer handbag that retailed for nearly $3,000. 2 weeks later, while supposedly dodging asset seizure, she tagged herself at a luxury boutique spa on the coast, sipping champagne in a private cabana. I took high-resolution screenshots of every single purchase, every vacation tag, and every expensive dinner she flaunted during her fake crisis. I pasted the images into a digital timeline. I placed her tearful text messages demanding my inheritance right next to photographs of her wearing custom jewelry bought on the exact same dates. The narrative she sold to our aunts and uncles collapsed under the weight of her own vanity. I dropped the timeline into the receipts folder. By Thursday night, the trap was constructed. I had the motive, the mechanism of the crime, and the proof of their intent. But presenting this evidence over the phone or through an email would give my father time to spin a new lie. He was a master manipulator. If I confronted him remotely, he would claim his network was hacked or that Jessica sent the fax without his knowledge. He would pit us against each other and slip through the cracks. I needed him to admit his role out loud in a room where he could not escape the consequences. I picked up my phone and texted my father back to finalize the logistics for Sunday. I maintained a submissive, defeated tone. I typed that I wanted to make sure everything was handled legally so we would not have to revisit the issue again. I told him I was bringing a mobile notary with me to the house to witness the signatures and authorize the transfer on the spot. My father replied instantly. He loved the idea. To him, a notary meant the surrender was official. It meant I was bringing the final tool he needed to legitimize the forged document he had already submitted to the bank. He told me he would have lunch prepared, and that Jessica was very relieved. He was gleefully setting the table for his own destruction. But I had no intention of hiring a standard notary public. A standard notary would just verify my identity and stamp a piece of paper. I needed a witness who possessed the institutional authority to drop an anvil on their scheme. I called Julian Sterling one last time on Friday afternoon. I asked him a question that fell far outside the normal boundaries of bank customer service. I explained the setup for the Sunday meeting. I told him my father and sister were planning to present me with the fraudulent transfer documents in person. I told him they believed they had successfully coerced me into signing away the trust. Then I asked Julian if he would be willing to drive to Charlotte and attend the meeting as my guest. I framed it not as a favor to me, but as an unprecedented opportunity for his fraud department. Bank investigators spend their entire careers chasing ghosts across digital networks. They rarely get the chance to sit in a room and watch the perpetrators attempt a federal wire fraud in real time. I told Julian that if he attended under the guise of being my notary, my father would speak freely. He would admit to drafting the paperwork. He would lay out the entire extortion plot. Julian was silent for a full minute. I could hear the faint sound of his office chair squeaking as he weighed the legal implications. As a senior investigator, he possessed the field authorization to verify client identities in person under extenuating circumstances. A frozen trust account involving a forged signature of $250,000 certainly qualified as extenuating. Finally, his voice came through the speaker, crisp and resolute. He told me to text him the address. He agreed to arrive at the house at 2 o'clock sharp. I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter. The heavy, humid air of the Carolina evening pressed against my windows, but inside my townhouse, the atmosphere was perfectly cold. The detective phase was over. I had gathered every receipt. I had secured the ultimate witness. My father and sister spent my entire life assuming I was too soft to fight back. They were about to learn what happens when the easy child finally stops absorbing the damage and decides to return it. The countdown to Sunday had officially started. Sunday morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost heavy. I woke up hours before my alarms, staring at the ceiling of my townhouse as the gray light of dawn slowly crept across the plaster. Today was the day. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the witness was en route. But knowing you hold the winning hand does not automatically erase a lifetime of fear. I walked into my kitchen and opened the small wooden memory box, sitting on the top shelf of my pantry. Inside rested my grandmother Vivian's antique pocket watch. It was a silver timepiece on a delicate chain tarnished around the edges from decades of use. She used to carry it in her coat pocket when she walked me to elementary school. I picked up the watch and held it in the palm of my hand. The metal was cool against my skin. It possessed a steady, rhythmic ticking that I could feel in my fingertips. This was my pebble. When you treat patients with severe neurological trauma, you teach them to find a physical anchor, a sensory object that grounds them in reality when a panic attack threatens to pull them under. My family specialized in inducing panic. They survived by making me feel small, confused, and desperate for their approval. Holding that silver timepiece reminded me exactly who I was protecting. I was not just defending my own bank account. I was honoring the woman who worked her entire life to ensure I would never end up trapped in my father's endless cycle of financial ruin. I slipped the watch into the front pocket of my trousers. The weight of it against my hips served as a silent promise. I dressed in a sharp, structured blazer and dark slacks, choosing clothes that felt like armor. At 1 o'clock, I grabbed my keys and walked out to my car. The drive from my modest neighborhood to my father's affluent suburb took 45 minutes, and my body reacted to every single mile marker. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My palms grew slick with cold sweat, forcing me to grip the steering wheel tighter. The air conditioning blasted through the vents, but the cabin of the sedan felt suffocating. To fight the rising tide of anxiety, I focused on the ticking watch in my pocket and repeated a simple grounding mantra out loud. I am the architect of this room. I said the words over and over, timing them with the rhythm of my turn signal. I am the architect of this room. They are walking into my structure. I turned into my father's subdivision. The transition is always jarring. You leave the cracked pavement of the city and suddenly glide onto pristine, manicured asphalt. Wide green lawns stretch out in front of towering brick homes. The neighborhood is a monument to the appearance of wealth. My father lived in a 4-bedroom colonial house with pristine white columns and a perfectly edged driveway. I parked my older sedan behind Jessica's least luxury SUV. I turned off the ignition, took one final deep breath, and walked up the pristine brick pathway to the front porch. Before I could even press the doorbell, the heavy oak door swung open. My father stood in the foyer wearing a casual cashmere sweater and a beaming, radiant smile. The transformation was nauseating. Gone was the cold, calculating enforcer from the diner who threatened to disown me over a cup of bitter coffee. In his place stood the warm, forgiving patriarch, welcoming his stray daughter back into the fold. He reached out and pulled me into a tight hug. I kept my arms pinned to my sides, my skin crawling at the false affection. Jessica appeared a moment later, gliding out of the kitchen with a pitcher of iced tea. She wore a flowy, expensive silk blouse, and her hair was perfectly curled. She looked nothing like a woman facing imminent bankruptcy and homelessness. She set the pitcher down and offered me a honeyed, sympathetic smile, the kind of expression you give a child who finally stopped throwing a tantrum. She thanked me for coming. She praised me for doing the right thing and putting family first. They ushered me into the living room, offering me a plush armchair. The air inside the house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and roasting chicken. It was an elaborate stage play. They were setting a scene of domestic tranquility to make my surrender feel like a joyous homecoming. They poured my tea into a crystal glass and asked polite, superficial questions about my work schedule. I answered in short, quiet sentences. I played the role of the defeated, compliant daughter perfectly. I watched them exchange a brief, triumphant glance over the rims of their glasses. They were blinded by their own greed. They truly believed they had broken me. 10 minutes later, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. My father stood up, brushing a piece of invisible lint from his trousers, and asked if that was the notary I mentioned. I nodded, setting my glass down on a coaster. I told him my contact had arrived to finalize the paperwork. My father opened the door, and Julian Sterling stepped into the foyer. Julian did not look like a standard bank investigator, nor did he look like a simple public notary. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit perfectly, a crisp white shirt, and a subtle blue tie. He carried a sleek leather portfolio under his right arm. His posture was impeccable, projecting an aura of quiet, unmistakable authority. He scanned the room with intelligent, observant eyes, taking in the crystal glasses, the cashmere sweater, and the luxury vehicle parked outside. He was evaluating the suspects. I stood up and walked over to the entryway. I kept my introduction brief and intentionally vague. I gestured toward him and told my father this was Julian and he was here to oversee the paperwork. My father extended his hand, offering Julian the same booming fake warmth he used on me. He thanked Julian for coming out on the Sunday. He joked about how tedious legal documents can be, and offered him a glass of iced tea. Jessica waved from the living room, batting her eyelashes and acting the part of the relieved, grateful sister. Julian shook my father's hand firmly. He declined the beverage with a polite, even tone. He stated he preferred to get straight to the business at hand. The dramatic irony in the room was thick enough to choke on. I stood watching my father and sister smile at the very man who held their criminal fate in his leather portfolio. Because Julian did not wear a badge or carry a gun, they dismissed him entirely. They categorized him as a low-level clerk, a background character I hired to stamp their victory. Their inherent arrogance prevented them from asking a single clarifying question. They did not ask for his last name. They did not ask to see his notary commission stamp. They simply saw a man in a suit, ready to process their stolen money, and their greed overrode any basic instinct for self-preservation. My father clapped his hands together, signaling the end of the pleasantries. He suggested we move into the formal dining room, where we would have plenty of space to spread out the documents. He led the way, practically skipping across the hardwood floor. Jessica followed close behind, holding a yellow legal pad tightly against her chest. Julian caught my eye for a fraction of a second as we trailed behind them. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was officially closed. The walls were sealed. We entered the dining room, a space dominated by a massive mahogany table surrounded by high-backed chairs. My father took his seat at the head of the table, adopting the posture of a king holding court. Jessica sat to his right, placing her yellow legal pad directly in front of her. I took the seat across from her. Julian remained standing for a moment, selecting a chair at the far end of the long table, establishing a clear vantage point where he could observe all three of us. He opened his leather portfolio, withdrew a silver pen, and waited in perfect silence. The false hospitality evaporated, replaced by a tense, eager energy. Jessica cleared her throat, smoothed her hands over her legal pad, and prepared to read the script that would trigger the explosion. The dining room inside my father's house was specifically designed to intimidate guests. A heavy crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the polished mahogany table, reflecting off the flawless surface. The space smelled of lemon furniture polish and the roasting chicken wafting in from the kitchen. My father took his customary seat at the head of the table, resting his forearms against the dark wood. He folded his hands together, adopting the solemn, measured posture of a judge presiding over a difficult but necessary hearing. Jessica sat to his immediate right, her posture rigid, clutching the bright yellow legal pad against her silk blouse. I took the chair directly across from her, keeping my back perfectly straight. Julian Sterling remained standing for a brief moment before selecting a seat at the far end of the long table. He placed his sleek leather portfolio on the surface, unclasped the hidden metal lock, and extracted a fresh notepad along with a silver pen. He sat down, crossed his legs, and waited in perfect silence, blending seamlessly into the background of their theatrical production. My father cleared his throat to signal the beginning of the meeting. He played the role of the benevolent mediator, a character he perfected during my childhood. Whenever Jessica broke one of my toys or borrowed my clothes without asking, he would convene these exact types of family summits. His goal was always to force me into offering forgiveness to maintain the peace under his roof. He looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured sadness. He stated that the past few weeks had been a dark chapter for our family. He spoke about the importance of unity and the danger of letting outside influences sever the bonds of blood. He praised me for finally seeing reason and coming to the table to heal the rift. His introduction was smooth, practiced, and entirely meant to disarm my defenses before the real extraction began. After delivering his opening remarks, he turned to my sister and gave her a gentle, encouraging nod. Jessica took a deep breath, setting the yellow legal pad down on the table. Her manicured fingers traced the edge of the lined paper. She did not look at me immediately. She stared down at her handwritten notes, allowing the silence in the room to stretch, building a manufactured tension. When she finally raised her eyes to meet mine, they were already brimming with fresh, carefully summoned tears. She began to read. Her voice carried a fragile, trembling quality that she modulated with the skill of a seasoned actress. She spoke about our childhood cherry-picking memories, where we played together in the backyard, conveniently ignoring the decades of neglect and financial parasitism that followed. As she continued reading, the structure of her speech revealed a fascinating psychological blueprint. She was reading from the pad, but the words were not her own. Jessica was a woman who routinely struggled to calculate the tip on a restaurant bill. Yet the sentences flowing from her mouth were dense with complex financial terminology and corporate legal phrasing. She talked about the moral obligation of redistributing shared family resources during periods of temporary liquidity crises. She mentioned the fiduciary duty we held to protect the family name from public bankruptcy. I sat quietly dissecting every syllable. My father was a former day trader who loved to use sterile financial jargon to justify his reckless gambling. He had written every single word on that yellow pad. He was using his favorite child as a human shield, broadcasting his demands through her tears, because he knew I had a lifelong habit of trying to fix her problems. The script then pivoted to the fabricated emergency. Jessica described the imaginary injured client who supposedly fell off the defective stationary bike at her cycling studio. She painted a vivid, agonizing picture of the pending lawsuit, claiming the plaintiff's attorneys were preparing to freeze her commercial bank accounts by Friday morning. She wept openly as she described the terror of potentially losing her business, her home, and her reputation in the community. She leaned heavily into the guilt trip, stating that she laid awake at night, wondering why her own sister would watch her drown, when a lifeline was sitting in a locked bank vault. Listening to her weave this fictional disaster required every ounce of my professional discipline. I knew there was no lawsuit. I knew there were no aggressive plaintiff attorneys. The only creditor breathing down her neck was the private hard money lender she had contacted to secure a shadow debt using my stolen identity. She was utilizing a ghost story to extract real currency. I forced my body to remain perfectly still. I did not cross my arms, nor did I break eye contact. I kept my breathing slow and measured, inhaling quietly through my nose and exhaling through my mouth. I slipped my right hand into my trouser pocket and gripped the cool silver metal of my grandmother's antique watch. The steady rhythmic ticking against my palm anchored me to reality, preventing the toxic wave of emotional extortion from pulling me under. I let them dig the hole deeper, offering no resistance, providing no verbal confirmation. At the far end of the mahogany table, Julian Sterling was hard at work. My father and sister assumed he was merely a hired notary public, waiting for the appropriate moment to stamp a document. They ignored him entirely, treating him like a piece of the furniture. They did not realize they were delivering a recorded confession directly to a senior federal bank auditor. Julian kept his head bowed, his silver pen gliding rapidly across the pages of his leather notepad. He was transcribing their exact phrases. He documented the mentions of the trust fund, the specific financial demands, and the clear, undeniable coercion tactics being deployed to force a transfer of restricted assets. The quiet scratching of his pen against the paper was the only sound competing with Jessica's theatrical sobs. The performance reached its crescendo. Jessica let her voice crack on a final dramatic sentence about how much she loved me despite my recent stubbornness. She reached into the pocket of a sleek leather folder sitting beneath her legal pad and pulled out a crisp white document. It was a standard bank transfer authorization form designed to formally move the funds from my restricted trust into a joint checking account controlled by our father. They had printed it at home, likely to serve as the final physical proof to legitimize the forged facts they had already sent to the Wealth Management Division. Jessica placed her hand flat on the document. She slid the paper across the polished wood of the mahogany table. The friction of the page moving over the surface made a soft, sweeping sound that echoed in the quiet dining room. The document came to a halt directly in front of me, resting next to a crystal glass of untouched iced tea. Beside the paper, she placed a heavy gold-plated ink pen. She looked at me, her eyes shining with fake sorrow, her chin trembling in a perfect display of manufactured vulnerability. She delivered the closing line of the script my father had written for her. It was designed to be the ultimate emotional kill shot, the sentence that would finally break my resolve and force my compliance. "Just sign it, Ash. It is what Grandma would have wanted." The gold-plated pen sat on the polished mahogany wood, catching the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. Jessica kept her hand resting near the edge of the transfer authorization form, waiting for me to pick up the writing instrument and surrender my future. The dining room fell into a suffocating quiet. I did not reach for the pen. I did not blink. I kept my hand inside my pocket, my fingers wrapped tightly around the cool silver casing of my grandmother's antique watch. I looked at my sister, whose fake tears were slowly drying on her cheeks as the silence stretched beyond the boundaries of normal conversation. Her expression shifted from manufactured sorrow to genuine confusion. She glanced toward the head of the table, seeking guidance. My father frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together in irritation. He opened his mouth to deliver another commanding lecture, ready to push me over the edge of compliance. He never got the chance to speak. At the far end of the long table, Julian Sterling stopped writing. He placed the cap back onto his silver pen with a sharp, definitive click. In the heavy quiet of the room, the sound echoed like a final gavel strike. Julian closed his leather notepad and slid it neatly into his portfolio. He did not rush. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a predator that has already cornered its prey. He rested his forearms on the table, interlaced his fingers, and looked directly at the man sitting at the head of the table. "I am Julian Sterling," he said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a dense, chilling authority that commanded the oxygen in the room. "I am a senior fraud investigator for the Wealth and Trust Management Division of your daughter's banking institution." The physical transformation of my father was instantaneous and breathtaking. The smug, patriarchal confidence evaporated from his posture. The healthy flush in his cheeks drained away, leaving a pallid gray tone behind. His jaw slackened and his shoulders dropped as if a heavy weight had just crashed down upon his spine. He recognized the title immediately. A man who spent his life dodging creditors and manipulating financial loopholes knew exactly what a federal bank auditor represented. He understood in a fraction of a second that the fortress he thought he was infiltrating was actually a steel cage, and the door had just locked behind him. Jessica, however, lacked the baseline financial literacy to understand the immediate danger. She blinked, her brow furrowing in irritation. She looked at Julian, then darted her eyes back to me, assuming I had brought a rogue legal clerk who was overstepping his boundaries. She tried to maintain her theatrical momentum, scoffing loudly and waving her manicured hand in dismissal, asking why a bank employee was interrupting a private household matter. Julian turned his gaze toward my sister. The cold intensity in his eyes made her flinch. He spoke to her with the clinical precision of a prosecuting attorney addressing a hostile witness on the stand. He pointed a single finger toward the yellow legal pad resting near her elbow. Reading a fabricated narrative to extract $250,000 from a restricted beneficiary is not a private household matter, Julian stated, his tone devoid of any sympathy. You just spent the last 10 minutes detailing a fictional personal injury lawsuit. You utilized false claims of impending bankruptcy to coerce the primary account holder into surrendering protected assets. I have transcribed every single threat you made. What you call a family discussion, the federal government categorizes as attempted extortion and financial coercion. Jessica opened her mouth, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. The color rushed out of her face. The realization began to penetrate her arrogance. This man was not here to verify a signature. He was here to document a felony. Julian did not give her time to recover. He shifted his attention back to the true architect of the scheme. He reached inside his sleek leather portfolio and extracted a single sheet of printed paper. He placed it flat on the mahogany surface and pushed it down the length of the table. The paper glided over the polished wood and came to a halt right next to the gold pen. It was the high-resolution copy of the forged transfer authorization form. My father stared down at the document as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His chest began to rise and fall in rapid, shallow breaths. You faxed this authorization request to my intake department on Tuesday afternoon. Julian continued, keeping his voice painfully even. You lifted an outdated signature from a 10-year-old student loan application and digitally pasted it onto a modern banking form. You assumed our processing center would simply rubber stamp the transaction without verifying the origin. My father gripped the edges of his chair. He tried to project strength, but his knuckles were bone white. He attempted to interject, opening his mouth to speak, but Julian raised a hand demanding uninterrupted silence. Every document transmitted to a secure financial institution carries a digital fingerprint, Julian explained, breaking down the mechanics of the trap. Our security servers capture the metadata of every incoming file. We pulled the routing history on your fax. The transmission originated from a residential internet service provider. The IP address resolves to this exact zip code, this specific street, and the router located inside your home office. The silence returning to the dining room was heavy and suffocating. The grand illusion of the loving, misunderstood family was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The proof was sitting in plain sight, backed by undeniable digital tracking. Julian leaned forward slightly, closing the distance. Taking a stolen signature and transmitting it across state lines to a federally insured institution elevates this from a domestic dispute to a severe federal offense. You committed wire fraud. The penalties for attempting to misappropriate a restricted trust of this magnitude involve mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines and substantial monetary fines. Panic finally broke through my father's paralyzed state. The patriarch crumbled, replaced by a sweating, desperate man trying to talk his way out of a burning building. He stammers, his voice cracking under the pressure. He let out a dry, horrifying laugh, attempting to minimize the catastrophic reality of the situation. He threw his hands up in the air, claiming Julian was entirely overreacting to a simple miscommunication. This is just a giant misunderstanding, my father pleaded, looking frantically between Julian and me. It was just preliminary paperwork. I was just trying to save time on the processing end. I intended to get Ashley to sign the real documents today to replace that placeholder. We are family. There is no fraud here, just a father trying to help his daughters navigate a complicated estate transition. He was trying to shrink a federal crime into a harmless clerical error. He hoped the word family would act as a magic shield, deflecting the legal consequences of his actions. Julian Sterling did not entertain the lies. He did not argue. He did not debate the semantics of the word placeholder. He simply tapped his index finger twice against the mahogany table. The sharp sound cut through my father's pathetic rambling. There is no paperwork left to process, Julian stated, delivering the final crushing blow. The security division flagged your transmission the moment it hit our servers. I advised the primary account holder to initiate a hard freeze. The trust account was permanently locked 48 hours ago. The transfer form is dead. No funds will be moved today, tomorrow, or ever. Neither of you will ever access a single dime of that inheritance. My father collapsed back into his high-backed chair, his eyes wide and vacant. The reality of the impenetrable wall hit him with the force of a freight train. But across the table, a different kind of realization was dawning on my sister. Jessica sat frozen, staring at the forged document. Her mind was frantically connecting the dots. If the trust account was permanently locked, then the forged facts had failed. If the forged facts failed, then the shadow debt she secured with the private hard money lender was completely unsupported. The $75,000 cash advance she took out was hanging in the wind, tethered to nothing but her own failing business and her personal assets. The fake emergency she invented to steal my money was about to become a devastating financial apocalypse, and the man who promised her the scheme was foolproof was sitting right next to her. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted from stunned silence to explosive hostility. The dining room air turned toxic the moment Jessica realized the hard money lender was going to seize her cycling studio. The realization hit her physical body like an electric shock. She shot out of her high-backed chair, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. Her carefully constructed facade of the weeping, fragile victim disintegrated in a fraction of a second. The pampered sister became a terrified, trapped animal. She slammed her manicured hands flat on the mahogany table and pointed a trembling finger directly at our father. She turned her wrath entirely on the man who had enabled her worst impulses for her entire life. She yelled that he swore the bank would process the facts without flagging the signature. She laid bare the mechanics of their conspiracy right in front of Julian Sterling. She screamed that Richard promised he could bully me into signing the physical paperwork this afternoon to legitimize the digital forgery retroactively. Her voice echoed off the crystal chandelier, sharp and panicked. She cried out that she took the $75,000 cash advance based on his specific instructions, and now she was going to lose her commercial lease and her home because his bulletproof plan was a catastrophic failure. My father tried to hush her. He held his hands up, his eyes darting nervously toward the federal auditor sitting at the far end of the table. He hissed at Jessica to keep her mouth shut, warning her that she was digging a deeper hole. But a drowning person does not care who they pull under the water. Jessica continued to wail, accusing him of ruining her life, tearing down the very pedestal he had placed her on for 3 decades. The alliance between the two antagonists cannibalized itself in spectacular fashion. When my father realized he could no longer control his favorite daughter, the cornered patriarch finally snapped. He abandoned the warm paternal act he used to greet me at the front door. His posture rigidified. The cashmere sweater suddenly looked absurd on a man radiating such intense malice. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. Unable to silence Jessica, he turned his head and locked his eyes on me. Decades of buried resentment boiled to the surface, breaking through the dam of his fake respectability. He snarled that I was exactly like my grandmother. Vivian had always been a sore subject in his house. When he lost his corporate job and gambled away our childhood savings on day trading margins, Vivian refused to bail him out. She treated him with the cold disdain he earned. My father told me he hated the way she looked down on him, and he hated that she bypassed his authority to leave her estate to a child. He transferred every ounce of his humiliation and failure directly onto my shoulders. He leaned over the mahogany table, his fists planted firmly on the wood. He delivered a bitter, venomous monologue admitting to every single moving part of their trap. He stated he wrote the script on the yellow legal pad because I was too dense to understand family duty on my own. He admitted he was the one who contacted Marcus, the private lender. He orchestrated the collateral pledge because he firmly believed that $250,000 belonged to him by right. He provided the roof over my head for 18 years, and in his mind my grandmother's wealth was his delayed compensation for raising an ungrateful daughter. He demanded to know why a selfish physical therapist deserved a life of financial security while his own brilliant business ventures floundered. Every word out of his mouth was a confession to wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. He practically shouted the details, blinded by his own toxic entitlement and the sting of being outmaneuvered by the child he deemed invisible. He listed his grievances, detailing how he felt robbed of his rightful status as the wealthy head of the family. While his bitter words filled the room, I maintained my clinical stillness. I did not shrink back into my chair. My right hand remained deep in the pocket of my blazer. My fingers rested against the silver casing of the antique pocket watch, but my thumb rested against the smooth glass screen of my smartphone. The device was active. A high-definition digital voice recording application had been running continuously since I parked my sedan in his pristine driveway. In the state of North Carolina, recording a private conversation is governed by a one-party consent statute. The legal framework explicitly dictates that as long as one active participant in a conversation consents to the recording, the audio capture is entirely lawful. You do not need a court-ordered warrant. You do not need the permission of the hostile parties sitting across from you. I was an active participant in this family meeting, and I was capturing a flawless audio file of my father confessing to a federal banking crime and outlining his extortion plot. He finished his tirade, his chest heaving, his face flushed a deep, angry red. He stood there expecting a reaction. He expected the easy child to shrink back in fear, to apologize for provoking his wrath, to offer a panicked compromise, to soothe his bruised ego. But the old programming was dead. The woman sitting across from him was a stranger who held the keys to a cage he built for himself. The contrast between his raging entitlement and my icy composure drained the remaining energy from his posture. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear for the father I was losing, because that father had never truly existed. I slowly stood up from the mahogany table. Julian Sterling mirrored my movement, sliding his chair back with a quiet, polite scrape against the floorboards. The federal auditor clasped his leather portfolio under his arm, his expression unreadable, his official duty fulfilled as a witness to the unraveling. I picked up my leather purse from the floor and slung the strap over my shoulder. I looked at the yellow legal pad resting near Jessica's elbow, the pages covered in his manipulative handwriting. Then I looked directly into my father's eyes. I saw the exact moment he realized the intimidation tactics had failed permanently. The silence stretching between us was cold and final, marking the end of a 30-year dynamic. I spoke with a quiet, measured tone that carried more weight than any theatrical scream. I told him he had spent my entire life teaching me that I was a burden, and today he proved that I was only valuable to him as a resource to plunder. I kept my gaze steady, refusing to offer him an ounce of the emotional reaction he craved. I turned toward the entryway, taking a single step away from the heavy wooden table. I paused, looking back at the two strangers standing in the dining room, trapped in the nightmare of their own making. I told my father I had no family left. I walked out of the room, my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Julian Sterling followed closely behind me, acting as a silent professional escort out of the hostile environment. We left them standing in the wreckage of their own greed. But the conflict was not entirely resolved. The morning sun would bring a harsh reality check because a private hard money lender does not care about family drama. They only care about collecting their debts, and Jessica was about to face the real-world consequences of borrowing money she did not have. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, severing the audio feed of the dining room. Muffled shouts still vibrated through the thick wood, echoing slightly in the quiet suburban foyer. My sister was shrieking at the top of her lungs. My father was bellowing in defense. They were tearing each other apart inside that pristine colonial house, their toxic alliance crumbling under the weight of their own failed scheme. Julian Sterling and I walked down the brick pathway in complete silence. The late afternoon Carolina sun cast long, cooling shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. The air felt remarkably light. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of pine needles and warm asphalt. I had carried a suffocating pressure in my chest since I was a small child, a constant buzzing anxiety that I was solely responsible for fixing their mistakes. That pressure was permanently gone, left behind on a mahogany table alongside a forged document and a useless gold pen. We reached the edge of the driveway where our vehicles were parked. Julian paused before opening the door to his sleek sedan. He turned and looked at me with a profound, quiet respect. He adjusted his leather portfolio under his arm and stated that the fraud department would officially refer the forged facts to their internal legal counsel by Monday morning. He thanked me for the invitation to the house, noting that field investigations rarely conclude with such definitive, undisputed audio evidence. We shook hands. It was a firm professional exchange between two people who had just successfully dismantled a criminal operation. I watched his car disappear down the tree-lined street, gliding past the affluent homes built on illusions. I slid into the driver's seat of my own older vehicle. I drove back to my modest townhouse, locked the deadbolt, and slept for 9 uninterrupted hours. Monday morning dawned bright and clear. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and stood by my kitchen window watching my working-class neighborhood wake up. The creeping dread that usually accompanied the start of a new week was entirely absent. I felt secure. I felt untouchable within the boundaries I had drawn. But toxic systems do not collapse without generating dangerous debris. At 9:15, my cell phone vibrated sharply against the granite countertop. The caller identification displayed a local Charlotte area code. It was not a saved contact. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the speaker to my ear, expecting a routine call from the rehabilitation clinic. The voice on the other end skipped any polite introduction. It was Marcus, the private lending agent who had left the aggressive voicemail on Thursday night. His tone was sharp, impatient, and laced with the arrogant assumption that he held the upper hand in the negotiation. He asked if he was speaking to Ashley Graham, the primary guarantor for the boutique fitness studio bridge loan. He did not wait for a confirmation. He launched into a rapid-fire lecture stating that his commercial suite had not received the finalized collateral pledge forms. He warned me that the $75,000 cash advance was scheduled for an immediate recall. He threatened to initiate hostile collection procedures, ruin my pristine credit score, and drag me into civil court if the signed paperwork did not hit his desk by the end of the business day. A week ago, a phone call from a hostile creditor threatening civil litigation would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have scrambled to appease him, apologizing profusely for a clerical error I did not even make. Instead, I stood in the sunlight streaming through my kitchen window and took a slow sip of my black coffee. The liquid was hot and grounding. I let him finish his blustering threats. I listened to the heavy silence hanging on the line when he finally paused to take a breath. I spoke with the same clinical detached authority Julian Sterling had utilized in the dining room the previous afternoon. I informed the lending agent that I was not a guarantor for any commercial loan associated with Jessica. I stated clearly and unequivocally that my signature on his preliminary pledge paperwork was a deliberate forgery. The line went dead silent for 3 long seconds. When Marcus spoke again, the arrogant bluster was gone, replaced by a dangerous low growl. Private creditors operate on the bleeding edge of the standard financial system. They take high risks, and they do not appreciate being manipulated by their clients. He accused me of trying to back out of a binding legal agreement. He said my sister had explicitly leveraged a restricted trust fund sitting in my legal name, and he had the initial application documents to prove her claims. He insisted I was legally tethered to the debt. I did not argue with his rising temper. I simply provided him with a factual map of the wreckage. I told him my sister had indeed attempted to use my inheritance as collateral, but she did so by committing federal wire fraud. I explained that she submitted a fabricated authorization form to my wealth management division to gain illegal access to the account, assuming the ruse would work, before he verified the assets. I gave him the name of my banking institution and offered to provide the direct phone extension for Julian Sterling in the fraud department, encouraging him to verify the active federal investigation himself. I informed him that the trust account was permanently locked, heavily monitored, and completely untouchable. I could hear the rapid sound of a keyboard clacking in the background on his end of the call. Marcus was verifying the bank information in real time. The grim reality of his unsecured $75,000 exposure was dawning on him. Private lenders require hard assets, and the asset he thought he secured had just vaporized into thin air. I decided to offer him a very specific tactical piece of advice. I told him that while my bank account was a dead end, his actual client still possessed significant tangible property. I suggested he look past the phantom trust fund and focus his aggressive collection efforts on the collateral she actually owned. I listed the expensive boutique cycling studio equipment she recently purchased, noting the high resale value of commercial spin bikes and imported sound systems. I mentioned the luxury SUV parked in her suburban driveway, clarifying that while the vehicle was leased, she had put down a substantial cash deposit that could be targeted. I pointed out the remaining equity sitting in her upscale home. I handed the predator a detailed map directing him straight toward his natural prey. I was not seeking petty revenge. I was simply returning the burden of her choices to the correct owner. Jessica built a fragile financial house of cards and expected me to act as the concrete foundation. By stepping out of the way, I guaranteed gravity would handle the rest. I told the lending agent he was free to pursue her actual property to recoup his substantial losses, but if he contacted my phone number again regarding this fraudulent account, I would add his firm to my pending police report. Marcus did not say goodbye. He processed the information, realized the gravity of his vulnerable position, and hung up the phone with a sharp, violent click. The connection severed. I lowered the device from my ear and set it back on the kitchen counter. The fifth layer of the conflict was officially resolved. Jessica tried to use me as a human shield to protect herself from a ruthless debt collector. Instead, the real-world consequences of her shadow loan snapped back onto her own shoulders with devastating precision. She was now trapped in a corner with a furious creditor who realized he had been conned and she had no safety net left to catch her fall. I finished my coffee, feeling a profound sense of closure settling over my morning. The financial threats were neutralized. The legal trap was sprung. I firmly believed the war was over and I could finally begin the slow process of healing. I assumed my father and sister would retreat in shame, focusing on surviving the impending fallout from the private lender and the bank auditors. But my father was a man who built his entire fragile identity on controlling the narrative within our community. He lost the inheritance money, and he lost his coercive leverage over me, but he still wielded significant social power within our extended family circle. As the morning shifted into the early afternoon, my phone began to vibrate again on the counter. This time, the incoming messages were not from angry creditors or federal investigators. They were from my aunts, my uncles, and lifelong family friends. My father had launched his final desperate offensive, initiating a vicious community smear campaign designed to destroy my reputation and rewrite the history of what actually happened in that dining room. The notifications began as a slow trickle shortly after the lunch hour, a few isolated text messages popping up on my screen. Within 30 minutes, that trickle mutated into an unrelenting deluge. My smartphone vibrated across the granite kitchen counter, dancing a frantic rhythm against the stone. The caller identification displayed a rotating gallery of my extended relatives. Aunts, uncles, and second cousins, who rarely spoke to me outside of obligatory Thanksgiving dinners, were suddenly treating my inbox like a digital courtroom. My father had launched his final desperate offensive. He lost the inheritance, and he lost his coercive leverage over me, but he still wielded significant social capital within our community. In our social circle, maintaining a pristine public image was the ultimate currency, and my father was a master at manipulating the narrative to ensure he always appeared as the victim. I unlocked my screen and scrolled through the barrage of incoming texts. The story my father spun was a masterpiece of character assassination. He called every prominent member of our extended family that morning and delivered a breathless, tragic performance. According to his fabricated timeline, I had let my new wealth corrupt my morals. He claimed I showed up at his house on Sunday afternoon accompanied by a hired thug posing as a fake attorney. He told my aunt that this imposter threatened him and tried to extort Jessica, demanding she empty her business checking account to add to my growing pile of cash. He painted a vivid picture of a loving father trying to defend his helpless eldest daughter from a greedy, vindictive sibling. The resulting outrage from my relatives was swift and fierce. Aunt Susan sent a block of text calling my behavior a profound disgrace to our family name. Uncle Robert, a retired local politician who prided himself on family values, left a voicemail stating that my grandmother would be heartbroken to see the monster I had become. Cousin David accused me of trying to ruin Jessica's life out of deep-seated jealousy. They did not ask for my side of the story. They did not request clarification. They swallowed my father's lies whole because the narrative fit the dynamic he had spent 3 decades cultivating. He was the charismatic patriarch, Jessica was the fragile star, and I was the invisible workhorse who had supposedly rebelled. A year ago, receiving this level of concentrated hostility from my own bloodline would have broken me. I would have spent hours drafting frantic emotional replies to every single person. I would have called Aunt Susan in tears, begging her to believe me. I would have exhausted myself trying to navigate the endless labyrinth of their misplaced anger. But standing in my kitchen on that Monday afternoon, looking at the glowing screen of my smartphone, I felt no urge to defend my character. The old programming was dead. I looked at their harsh accusations and felt a cold, surgical detachment. Engaging in an emotional debate with people committed to misunderstanding you is a waste of oxygen. When dealing with a coordinated smear campaign, words are useless. The only cure for a systemic lie is undeniable documented proof. I walked away from the buzzing phone on the counter, sat down at my small dining table, and opened my laptop. I navigated directly to the folder on my desktop labeled Receipts. It was time to deploy the arsenal I had meticulously assembled over the past 5 days. I treated the situation like a medical triage, applying clinical precision to stop the bleeding. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the official portal for the Federal Trade Commission. While Julian Sterling was handling the internal bank investigation, I needed a federal law enforcement document bearing my name. I filled out the official identity theft affidavit, detailing the forged authorization facts and listing my father and sister as the primary suspects. I submitted the forms under penalty of perjury. The government system generated a formal time-stamped incident report, complete with a federal reference number. I downloaded the official PDF document and dragged it onto my desktop. That was the first piece of ammunition. The second piece was already waiting in my secure inbox. Early that morning, the Wealth Management Division sent an automated but highly detailed status update regarding my trust. The email bore the official letterhead of the bank's fraud department. The text explicitly stated that account access was permanently suspended due to the receipt of a fraudulent wire transfer authorization form containing a forged signature. It confirmed an active security review was underway involving third-party individuals attempting unauthorized access. I saved the email as a separate PDF file. The third and final piece of evidence required a bit of digital tailoring. I opened the voice recording application on my phone and transferred the audio file from the Sunday dining room ambush onto my computer. The entire recording was over 40 minutes long, filled with Jessica's fake crying and my father's initial manipulative speeches. I loaded the file into a basic audio editing program. I did not want my relatives to have to sift through the preamble. I highlighted the exact 2-minute segment where the illusion shattered. I clipped the precise moment where my father dropped his loving patriarch act and began snarling his confession. The edited audio file was pristine. The crystal clear recording captured my father admitting he orchestrated the forgery. It captured him stating he felt entitled to my grandmother's wealth. It captured him confessing to setting up the private loan to leverage my stolen assets. There was no room for misinterpretation. His venomous tone and explicit descriptions of the wire fraud were permanently etched into the digital waveform. I exported the short audio clip and placed it right next to the FTC report and the bank statement. I opened my email client and created a new message. I did not type out a single specific email address in the recipient line. Instead, I opened my contact list and selected every single aunt, uncle, and cousin who had flooded my phone with insults that morning. I placed all 35 of their email addresses into the blind carbon copy field. This ensured they would all receive the message simultaneously, but they could not hit reply all to start a chaotic group argument. I was not opening a forum for discussion. I was delivering a verdict. The subject line of the email was sterile and precise. It read, "Formal clarification regarding Richard and Jessica." I did not begin the body of the message with a warm greeting. I kept the text brief, factual, and entirely devoid of emotion. I typed that I understood Richard had reached out to them regarding a recent family conflict. I stated that the narrative he provided was factually incorrect. I explained that I was not engaging in a debate, but I felt it was necessary to provide the actual documentation regarding the events of the past week so they could draw their own informed conclusions. I listed the 3 attachments using bullet points. I described the first file as a federal identity theft report filed against my father and sister. I described the second file as the official confirmation from the Bank Fraud Division regarding the forged signature they submitted. I described the third file as a direct audio recording of my father confessing to the aforementioned financial crimes in his own dining room. I concluded the email with a single sentence stating that I would be severing all contact moving forward to protect my legal and financial standing. I did not sign off with love. I simply typed my full name. I attached the 3 files, double-checked the blind carbon copy list, and clicked the send button. The progress bar zoomed across the bottom of the screen, and the message vanished into the digital ether, rocketing into 35 different inboxes across the state of North Carolina. I closed the laptop, walked back into the kitchen, and picked up my smartphone. It was still buzzing with a residual text message from a distant cousin telling me I needed to repent. I set the phone down and waited. The reaction was not immediate. It took roughly 5 minutes for people to open their emails, read the sterile text, and click on the attachments. It took 2 minutes for them to listen to the audio file of the charismatic family patriarch turning into a snarling, confessing criminal. And then something miraculous happened. The buzzing stopped. The unrelenting flood of incoming text messages, voicemails, and social media notifications ceased entirely. The silence that fell over my smartphone was absolute and profound. It was the sound of a carefully constructed, decades-old smear campaign being incinerated in real time by the blinding light of undeniable proof. Nobody texted back to argue. Nobody called to demand further explanation. The reality of the federal documents and the raw audio recording bypassed their cognitive dissonance and forced them to see the truth. They realized they had just spent their morning defending a man who was actively committing wire fraud against his own child. The silence was their collective shock, their embarrassment, and their sudden, terrified understanding that the easy child was no longer playing their game. The silence that followed the deployment of my email was not temporary. It stretched through the evening, continued into the next morning, and eventually settled into a permanent defining barrier between my past and my future. The 35 relatives who received the unvarnished truth regarding my father and sister chose the path of least resistance. They retreated into their own lives, too embarrassed by their misplaced outrage to offer apologies, and too confronted by the evidence to continue their attacks. The social warfare concluded, but the machinery of the real world had only just begun to turn. In the movies, financial crimes culminate in a dramatic climax. Sirens wail in the distance, armored vehicles surround a pristine suburban home, and the antagonists are hauled away in silver handcuffs while the neighborhood watches in stunned disbelief. Real life operates with a much colder, more bureaucratic precision. The punishment for my family did not arrive with flashing lights. It arrived in plain white envelopes sent through certified mail. Julian Sterling kept his word. The morning after our confrontation in the dining room, the bank internal legal counsel reviewed his field report. They examined the high-resolution scan of the forged authorization form, verified the metadata tracing the transmission back to the residential internet protocol address, and listened to the audio recording of the confession. Federal banking regulations leave zero room for internal discretion when wire fraud targets a restricted trust. The institution drafted a formal suspicious activity report and forwarded the entire digital package to federal and local financial regulatory authorities. The investigation moved out of the Bank Security Division and landed on the desks of government prosecutors. My father did not face a sudden raid, but he quickly discovered that fighting a federal inquiry is a punishment all on its own. A week after the dining room summit, a process server knocked on his heavy oak front door and handed him a stack of official subpoenas. The government demanded access to his home office computers, his personal banking records, and a decade of his tax returns. To prevent himself from being indicted and sent to a federal penitentiary, my father had to hire a specialized white-collar criminal defense attorney. In the city of Charlotte, legal representation of that caliber does not come cheap. The financial drain was agonizing and relentless. Defense firms require staggering upfront retainers just to open a file. They bill by the hour for every phone call, every email drafted, and every document reviewed. My father had spent his entire adult life projecting the image of a wealthy, successful patriarch, but his actual liquid assets were perilously thin. To keep his defense attorney working, he was forced to systematically dismantle his own financial foundation. He liquidated his remaining retirement portfolios, paying steep early withdrawal penalties just to access the cash. He sold his collection of expensive watches. He drained his savings accounts down to the final pennies. The profound irony was inescapable. He orchestrated a felony to steal $250,000 from his youngest daughter, and the resulting legal nightmare forced him to burn through his own net worth just to stay out of a prison cell. He was not incarcerated, but he was trapped in a slow-motion financial collapse that stripped away every ounce of his unearned pride. While my father battled subpoenas and hourly legal fees, my sister faced a much faster, more brutal reckoning. Marcus, the private lending agent, did not possess the patience of a federal investigator. He was a predator who had been promised a lucrative meal, and when he realized the trust fund collateral was a mirage, he turned his sights entirely onto the remaining assets. Jessica had 30 days to produce the $75,000 she borrowed. She did not have the capital. Her boutique cycling studio was operating at a severe deficit, and her personal credit cards were already pushed to their maximum limits. The day after the loan officially defaulted, Marcus executed his legal right to collect. He bypassed polite phone calls and filed a formal lien against her upscale residential property at the county clerk office. In North Carolina, property records are entirely public. Anyone searching her name in the municipal database could see the hostile claim attached to her home. The facade of the successful, thriving small business owner shattered in plain sight. The dominoes fell with ruthless speed. Her commercial landlord, already tired of receiving late rent payments, caught wind of the public lien and the impending financial disaster. He refused to grant her another extension. 2 weeks later, a bright orange eviction notice was taped to the glass door of her cycling studio. The neon inspirational signs were unplugged. The imported marble reception desk was auctioned off to cover back rent. Her business evaporated. To prevent Marcus from initiating an immediate foreclosure on her house, Jessica had to generate liquid cash instantly. She drove her leased luxury sports utility vehicle back to the dealership and surrendered the keys, swallowing a massive financial penalty just to escape the monthly payments. She sold her designer handbags to online consignment shops. She packed her expensive silk blouses and custom jewelry into cardboard boxes, listed her house for a fraction of its market value to secure a rapid cash buyer, and moved into a cramped, unremarkable apartment on the opposite side of the city. The woman who once mocked my budget and demanded I fund her lavish lifestyle was now forced to learn how to survive on the exact same terms I had navigated my entire adult life. I watched all of this unfold from a distance. Charlotte is a large city, but professional circles often overlap, and news travels through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances. A younger, more vindictive version of myself might have expected to feel a soaring sense of triumph watching their superficial empire crumble. I expected to feel the sweet rush of victory that comes from defeating the villains of your own story. But the reality of watching your own blood relatives destroy themselves offers no cinematic joy. It only offers a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. I went to work every morning at the rehabilitation clinic. I spent my days kneeling on padded mats helping children learn how to trust their own legs again. I documented patient progress, washed my hands, and drove back to my quiet townhouse. My life remained remarkably steady, but my mind felt like it had run a marathon. The adrenaline that fueled my detective work and sustained me through the dining room confrontation gradually faded, leaving behind a profound emptiness. I felt relief, genuine and absolute, knowing the anchor tying me to their sinking ship had finally been severed. But it was the type of relief you feel after surviving a terrible storm. You are grateful to be alive, but you still have to look at the wreckage left behind. I realized that keeping a window open to watch their downfall was only prolonging my own recovery. As long as I knew where they lived or what legal battles they were fighting, they were still occupying space in my mind. I needed to finalize the boundary I drew in that dining room. I needed to make the separation physical and digital. On a Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break, I drove to the retail store of my cellular service provider. I sat at a brightly lit counter and requested a brand new phone number. I did not port my old contacts over. I updated my emergency files at the clinic, provided the new digits to my landlord, and notified my banking institution. I logged into every single social media platform I had ever used. With methodical precision, I navigated to the privacy settings and systematically blocked my father and my sister. I did not stop there. I went through the contact list of the 35 extended relatives who had participated in the smear campaign and blocked every single one of them. I erased my digital footprint from their world entirely. I walked out of the cellular store, holding my updated device. The screen was completely silent. There were no manipulative text messages waiting for a response. There were no fabricated emergencies demanding my attention. There were no family summits to attend. The connection was permanently severed. I returned to my vehicle, started the engine, and merged onto the highway. The rear-view mirror reflected the sprawling skyline of the city, but I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. The long, exhausting war was officially over, and the path forward was finally entirely my own. 6 months have passed since the digital silence began. It is late spring in North Carolina. The harsh winter frost has surrendered to a vibrant, blooming warmth. I am standing on the cedar deck of my own backyard, holding a ceramic mug of green tea, watching the morning mist burn off the manicured grass. The property is bordered by tall, mature oak trees that offer a natural protective canopy over the yard. The deed to this 3-bedroom brick house rests in a fireproof safe in my home office. It is filed at the county courthouse under one single name: mine. I utilized a portion of my grandmother's preserved trust fund to secure a substantial down payment. The remaining balance rests securely in a high-yield account managed by Julian Sterling's division, accumulating interest for a future that nobody can ever steal. Stepping into this new reality required a profound mental adjustment. For my entire adult life, I operated from a defensive crouch. I existed in cramped apartments with squeaky floorboards, tracking every spare dollar on digital spreadsheets, constantly waiting for the next manufactured crisis to bleed my resources dry. Walking through empty, sunlit rooms without bracing for a panicked phone call from a crying sibling felt foreign at first. I spent the first few weeks in this house jumping every time the mail carrier dropped a parcel on the front porch or a car door slammed in the street. The human nervous system takes much longer to heal than a frozen bank account. The adrenaline that fueled my detective work and sustained me through the confrontation in the dining room lingered in my bloodstream, demanding an enemy to fight. But slowly the quiet became the new normal. I painted the living room walls a soft, calming blue. I planted hydrangeas along the front walkway and learned how to cultivate a garden. I started going to sleep at 9 in the evening and waking up feeling genuinely rested rather than exhausted before my shift at the rehabilitation clinic even began. The contrast between my current peace and the chaotic wreckage I left behind is staggering. People outside of these situations often assume that walking away from a toxic bloodline brings immediate, unblemished happiness. They expect a neat cinematic conclusion where the protagonist dances into the sunset without a single regret. The reality is far more complex. Some evenings, when the house is perfectly still and the rain is tapping against the window panes, a heavy wave of grief washes over me. I do not mourn the people my father and sister actually are. I mourn the profound loss of the people they were supposed to be. I grieve the phantom idea of a supportive father who would visit this new house, walk around the backyard, and offer proud, unsolicited advice about lawn maintenance. I miss the illusion of an older sister who would sit on this cedar deck with me, sharing a bottle of wine and laughing about our shared childhood memories. The grief is for a fantasy that never existed. Accepting that harsh reality is a bitter but necessary medicine. Therapy has provided a bright, unforgiving light to illuminate the mechanics of that fantasy. I spent countless hours dissecting the exact architecture of my family dynamic with a professional counselor. I needed to understand the underlying code. I needed to know why a parent would willingly sacrifice their independent, hardworking child to protect a reckless, manipulative one. The answer lies entirely in the fragile ego of the enabler. My father never saw Jessica as a separate, autonomous human being. He viewed her as a direct extension of his own identity. Her constant failures and financial blunders reflected his own deep-seated inadequacies. By constantly rescuing her and funding her illusions, he maintained a false narrative of control and success. He needed her to remain incompetent and dependent so he could feel powerful. In that twisted ecosystem, I was never meant to be a person with my own goals. I was the designated shock absorber. I was the load-bearing wall designed to hold up their crumbling structure. If I succeeded on my own terms, it highlighted their severe dysfunction. If I refused to fund her lavish lifestyle, it forced my father to confront the reality that he had raised an adult who could not survive without a safety net. Enablers do not protect the golden child out of genuine love. They protect the golden child to avoid facing their own colossal failures. The moment I stepped out of my assigned role and refused to absorb the damage, the entire system collapsed under the weight of its own gravity. I share this perspective because I know there are thousands of people operating as the shock absorbers in their own families. You are conditioned from a very young age to believe that setting a firm boundary is an act of cruelty. You are taught that prioritizing your own financial stability over a sibling's fabricated emergency is a betrayal of the family name. That guilt is a deliberate weapon designed to keep you trapped, providing endless fuel for a machine that will never stop consuming you. But walking away from a parasite is not a betrayal. Refusing to be extorted by the people who share your last name is not an act of selfishness. Prioritizing your own safety, your own peace, and your own future is the most fundamental act of survival. I reclaimed my grandmother's legacy. I built a sanctuary out of brick and wood, and I fortified it with ironclad boundaries. The silence I created by blocking 35 hostile relatives is no longer a terrifying void. It is a blank canvas where I get to paint the rest of my life. I go to work, I heal my patients, and I come home to a space that belongs entirely to me. I want to turn this over to you now. I want you to place yourself in that dining room, sitting across the mahogany table from a parent who spent weeks orchestrating a complex financial trap to drain your life savings. If your father orchestrated a bank fraud against you, would you have warned him before the trap closed, or would you have let the auditor drop the hammer just like I did? Tell me your answer in the comments. I read every single perspective. If you understand the deep, complex pain of walking away from your own blood, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Elderly Stories. You are not alone in this fight, and we have a community here that understands the heavy cost of peace. Stick around, because the next story in our queue features a mother-in-law who tried to secretly cancel her son's wedding venue just 3 days before the ceremony, completely unaware that the bride actually owned the catering company processing the cancellation. You will not want to miss how that reception unfolded. Take care of yourselves, and remember to always protect your peace. There is a pervasive myth woven deeply into the fabric of American culture, the belief that family is our ultimate safety net, an unbreakable bond that will catch us when the world inevitably lets us down. We are raised on holiday movies and Thanksgiving table tropes that insist blood is always thicker than water. But what happens when that safety net is actually a spider's web? What happens when the people assigned to protect you are the very ones plotting to consume you? Ashley's story forces us to look at the dark underbelly of the American family unit. We celebrate the self-made individual, the person who works 50-hour weeks, saves their money, and quietly builds a stable life. Yet within toxic family systems, that hard-earned independence is rarely celebrated. Instead, it is hunted. The responsible child is conditioned to be the invisible workhorse, while the golden child is permitted to remain a chaotic, dependent extension of the parents' own fragile egos. Ashley's profound realization was not just that her father and sister were stealing from her. It was the chilling discovery that they never truly saw her as a human being. To them, she was simply a locked vault, holding the resources they felt entitled to spend. The most difficult lesson embedded in this narrative is the agonizing cost of setting boundaries. In a society that demands we keep up appearances and preserve the family image at all costs, standing up to financial and emotional extortion makes you the villain in your own community. It takes a terrifying amount of courage to sit at a mahogany dining room table, a place meant for shared meals and laughter, and watch the people who raised you orchestrate a federal crime against you. Ashley didn't just defend her inheritance. She dismantled a 30-year illusion. She allowed the federal auditor to drop the hammer not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for survival. If you have ever found yourself sitting across from people who share your last name, but none of your values, you know exactly how heavy that silence feels. If Ashley's journey to reclaim her identity and her future resonates with the battles you are fighting behind closed doors, please take a moment to subscribe to Elderly Stories. We share these narratives because there is immense power in realizing you are not alone in the dark. Healing from this kind of betrayal is rarely a clean, cinematic victory. When the subpoenas have been served, the fake emergencies have collapsed, and the toxic relatives have been permanently blocked, you are left in a quiet, safe house that belongs entirely to you. But in the quiet hours of the morning, as the coffee brews and the neighborhood wakes up, a shadow often remains. You mourn the phantom family you deserved, but never had. You realize that you successfully burned the bridge, but sometimes you can still smell the smoke. It makes you wonder when you finally sever the ties that were slowly suffocating you. Do you ever stop bracing for the phone to ring,